So let's move on to our next biomolecule, carbohydrates. We've talked about nucleic acids. We've talked about proteins. I might try to reference those where I can in this video just to remind us, some of the key facts about those. But carbohydrates are composed of these three elements, typically carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. You might glean that from the name, carbon, carbohydrate, or 8, typically indicates the presence of oxygen in the molecule. Typically, you're going to find it, and I'll erase this so that you can see this, in this basic ratio of C, twice the amount of H, and about the amount of C you had oxygen. So, for instance, like if I had X amount of C, I would have 2X H, and typically I would have X amount of oxygen. Just as a general rule for carbohydrates, we have this kind of structure, which is kind of the reason I'm going over this is because this is much different than you're going to see with lipids, our next biomolecule, which also is composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So, the function, as you might know, quick energy, right? Put quick next to this. Quick energy, also energy storage, which is a more long-term energy situation, right? Not something you typically learn about freshman year because you're typically taught, long-term energy storage, that's only lipids. Carbs store energy as well. It's more easily accessible than lipids and more quick to break off a piece of glucose from a long chain of glycogen than it is to kind of break down these lipid molecules. So, energy storage. It is also a structural support for different types of organisms, different types of cells. So just make sure you know that it's energy and structure. That's typically what we find carbohydrates operating in. Sugars, starches. Sugars are the types of things you will see in your breakfast cereal. Obviously, table sugar, stuff you put in your coffee. So sugars, typically very sweet. Starches. These are things like potato, which you guys also probably enjoy quite a bit. Corn starch. There's also starch in corn starch and many vegetables. Cellulose. Plant matter often has this structural component. Again, we talk about structure up here, called cellulose, which is difficult to digest, but that's another place you'll find it, maybe in blades of grass and things like that. These are cellulose. Okay. Most names for sugar end in OSE. As you probably know, you've heard of things like glucose, right? Things like that. Glucose, sucrose, fructose. You see OSE quite a bit. They are classified by the number of carbons they have. A hex of sugar, glucose is a great example of this. If you count the carbons, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. 6 carbons. So a 6-carbon sugar would be called glucose. Or, it's a hexose. There's many different kinds of hexose depending on where these OH molecules are. Glucose is just one example of these. 5-carbon or pentose sugars, as you'll notice. Let's count them up again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Things like ribose, deoxyribose. These types of sugars all have 5 carbons. And of course, our 3 carbons. These are oftentimes our 2 glucose molecules broken down, which it appears what this is. Glyceraldehyde is an example of this. This is kind of half of this glucose molecule when it gets broken down in our system. Glyceraldehyde sometimes it has phosphate groups. Very important molecule, glyceraldehyde. We'll talk about that much later, especially when we get to how these things get broken down and converted back into energy. But for now, know that sugars are classified by the amount of carbons they have. The monosaccharides for sugars, things like glucose, these single rings. These are simple one-monomer sugars, such as glucose, which is an example up here on the right. You'll tell this as one ring, right? Disaccharides have 2 monomers. One example of that is maltose. We tasted this in class. Maltose has 2 glucose molecules. If you look at the structure of each of these, you'll notice that they are, and go ahead and take pause and compare these real quick. They're basically the same as this glucose molecule. That's because this is 2 joined glucose molecules, right? Glucose, this is glucose as well, and they're joined together. So this is specifically 2. A monomer is specifically 1. Polysaccharides are many, right? The word many should clue you into that. If you notice, these are long chains of monomers here that we're seeing. This is an example of cellulose, which we mentioned earlier in blades of grass, a structural component. Starch is kind of a storage molecule for energy that you'll find in plants. These are long, sometimes branching polymers. And this is kind of, this when we talk about the structural component, oftentimes we're going to be talking about these large polymers. Starch, again, is a good example. So sugars are built through the same process as everything else. You have sugars coming together, and obviously something to note here is you always have an enzyme that's catalyzing these reactions, right? You're removing water in order to form a bond, right? In order to form a bond, if this is, and I can't tell structurally, but it looks like this might be two glucose molecules. And as we already talked about, glucose and glucose, when you remove water from that, you form a bond, you get maltose. Oh, already has it written, so I need to write in my gobbledygook bad handwriting. Glucose and glucose is going to form, of course, those are monosaccharides. Enzyme comes by, removes water, and it forms maltose. This is a disaccharide. Now, this is the important point I want you to take away from this. The bond between two monomers of carbohydrates is called a glycosidic linkage. A glycosidic linkage, typically made again between two hydroxyl groups, if you'll notice that, OH. But a glycosidic linkage is the specific name for this type of bond between carbohydrate monomers. This is an important one to know. Definitely know this. Right? I'd like you to recall right now, if you would, pause the video. What are the name of the bonds between monomers of nucleic acids and proteins? See if you can name those from memory. If you can't, go back and look at your notes, and I will fill you in when I get back. Okay, you should have come up with the bonds between nucleic acids are called phosphodiester bonds, and between proteins are called peptide bonds. Peptide bonds. So those are two words you should know. Now there's a third one for your arsenal here: glycosidic linkage. Makes sense because glyco implies sugar, glucose, glyco. Similar to how these kind of indicate what they are bonding as well. So keep that in mind. Okay, let's look at some of these polymers of sugars more in depth. Polymers cost very little energy to build. They store a lot of energy, and they're easily reversible. So it's very good to release energy. You know, potatoes store tons of energy. This is kind of what this starch up here. This is an energy storage molecule for plants. Obviously, it looks like stench. Handwriting's terrible. Sorry. Starch, right? Energy storage for plants. Glycogen, the way we store energy is in a form called glycogen. It's in our liver, around our muscles. You're going to find a lot of glycogen. This is how we store energy in our carbohydrate form. Structure: cellulose, chitin, and arthropods and fungi. And if you'll notice over here, you have both of these can be seen in this image over here to the right. Right? We have cellulose and all this plant matter around here, right? Cellulose. We have chitin, and the insects, the exoskeleton of these insects, and around this fungi. These are complex polysaccharides, and they make up kind of the structural components of both of these organisms. So I just thought it was interesting because you have it all in one picture here. You have a mushroom with insects or arthropods around it, and cellulose in this plant matter all around everything. Okay, so here's a little review for you. This is kind of if you had to boil it all down to a couple words for everything, this is kind of the review. Monosaccharides, one monomer sugar, simple. Glucose, fructose, ribose are a few examples of that. Again, you don't necessarily need to know these specifically, except for possibly glucose and ribose, because those are important. Disaccharides, two linked monosaccharides. Some examples of that: maltose, sucrose, which is like your table sugar. Right? Polysaccharides are long chains with more than two monomers linked together. Examples of that are starch, glycogen, cellulose, and chitin. Again, rewind if you need to look up what those specifically are and what they do. The bonding between monomers are called glycosidic linkages. Glycosidic linkages. These are formed, like all bonds, most bonds in the body, are formed through dehydration synthesis. They function in energy storage, quick energy, and structure in some organisms. So this is kind of like the summary of everything we've learned so far. Make sure this stuff you know really well. So that's pretty much it. Okay, I will see you in the next video when we talk about lipids. Thank you.